I usually try as much as possible to avoid using cheap lenses, and it's not necessarily because I believe every expensive lens is automatically better. It is because when it comes to filmmaking, I don't want to compromise the quality of the image just for the sake of saving money. Because what's the point of having a really good camera like this if the glass you are putting in front of the camera is not really good enough to actually take advantage of the good sensor you have in your camera? In fact, when it comes to lenses, I would rather spend more money on my lens than on the camera body. Yes, when I'm even renting equipment, I make sure I pay attention to the lens I'm putting on the camera because I understand the role the lens plays. The lens is literally the highest your camera uses to see. So no matter how good your camera is, if the lens in front of the sensor isn't good enough, you're not going to be able to fully maximize the capacity of the sensor or the quality of the sensor you have. And normally, when you see a small lens like this, like the Viltrox 20mm f2.8 for Sony camera, you might look at it and just assume it's one of those very cheap, low quality lenses. And honestly, that is exactly what I also thought, but I decided to take a risk. Yes, I call it a risk because I genuinely was not expecting anything extraordinary from this lens. This lens cost about $176, and at that price point, I was not expecting anything much. But after actually taking it out and using it, I can tell you that this thing completely surpassed my expectations. So what exactly is this lens? This is the Viltrox AF 20mm f2.8, and it's a full frame autofocus prime lens designed for Sony E-mount cameras. You are going to get a 20mm focal lens and a maximum aperture of f2.8. You are going to get autofocus, electronic aperture control, internal focusing, and a minimum focusing distance of about 7.5 inches. And the lens itself is incredibly small and lightweight. Its weight around 157 grams, so this is one of those lenses you can literally just throw in your camera bag and probably forget that it's even there. And that is actually one of the things I really love about this lens. But the main reason I bought it was because I needed something really wide, and 20mm is actually really wide. If you're coming from something like the 24-70, you already know what 24 looks like. Now imagine 20mm. It gives you a more noticeable room in your footage, and when you are shooting in tight spaces, interior environment, documentary, event, travel, or even contents where you want to show the person and the environment around them, that extra width can make a huge difference. I took the lens out to a park and I started shooting, and I didn't want to just shoot bricks and walls or just use text charts and tell you how sharp it is and all of that. I wanted to actually use it in real world scenario. I wanted to shoot people, so I tried my best to shoot everything I could shoot people, making things, animals, environments, objects. I shot really wide angle because it's a wide angle lens. I got really close to subjects too. I tested the lens at different aperture, and I basically wanted to see where this lens starts to fall apart. And after looking at the footages in post-production, I was impressed. I was really you can look at the images on the screen. I was really impressed by the result I got, because saying this is not impressive would honestly be me lying. Now, the image quality itself, the first thing I notice is that the image coming out of this lens is not as contrasty as what you might get from a more expensive glass, and that is something you should know, right? If you put it side by side with a much more expensive Sony G Master lens or a proper cinema glass, you're going to see the difference. You should. Those lenses cost significantly more money. You get better optical performance, better consistency across the frame, and depending on the lens, better control over things like distortion, chromatic aberration, flare, and corner sharpness. But here is where I think people sometimes miss the point. We are talking about a lens that costs around $176 here, and for that money, what I'm getting here is actually very impressive. The contrast is not something that bothers me in real world use, especially because it's a wide angle lens, 20mm. When you're looking at a normal image with your eyes, you're probably not going to sit and notice every little thing happening in the corners unless you are deliberately looking for it. And if you're not pixel peeping, I think the image holds up really well. Now let's talk about the colors. Another thing that genuinely surprised me was the colors that was coming out from this lens. I wasn't expecting the color rendering from this lens at this price point to be this good. The footage has a nice natural look to it, and because I'm shooting in a Sony profile picture S-Log3 that I'm comfortable grading in, especially with my LUTs that I can just slap in, link is in the description, and which is very important to me. I'm not expecting this lens to magically give me a finished cinematic image straight out of the camera. That is not what a lens does, right? But I want the footage coming into the edit to give me enough information and enough quality to work with, and this lens does just that. And at f2.8, now, one of the reasons I find this lens interesting is the fact that it opens up to f2.8, and for a lens this small and affordable, that is actually a big deal. At f2.8 you can let in a decent amount of light, which makes it more useful in low light situations, and because you can also focus very close to the subject, you can create something interesting, you know, wide angle shots where the subject is close to the camera while still showing the environment around them. But obviously f2.8 isn't going to give you the same background separation you would get from something like the Viltrox 85mm f1.8. That is not what this lens is designed for. This lens is about perspective and the environment, and I actually think that is where this lens actually shines. I also tested it at different aperture, and this is where you start seeing some of the compromises that comes with a lens at these price points. I mean, wide open at f2.8, the center of the frame is quite good, but the corners aren't where the lens is at its strongest. Once you start stopping down, particularly around f5.6 and beyond, the overall frame becomes more consistent. So if I'm shooting something where I want the environment to be sharp across the frame, I'll probably stop it down. But if you're shooting documentary work, people, movement, and something where the subject is more important, like parts of the image, I'm perfectly comfortable with the f2.8. and that is the thing about this lens. You have to understand what the lens is actually designed to do, instead of expecting every lens to behave like a $2,000 lens or a G Master lens, because this is an autofocus lens, and honestly the autofocus is very decent and fast. I made some videos that were really fast while I was testing the autofocus. I tested it on my Sony camera, the Sony A7 IV, moving subject, and for the kind of shooting I was doing, it performed really well. Viltrox uses the STM autofocus motor, and the lens supports Sony AF and Face AF functions on compatible cameras. And for video, the fact that the focus is also relatively quiet is important, very quiet, because if your lens is constantly making noise, every frame it focuses, you're going to hear it in your microphone or somehow in your audio, and I didn't have that problem with this lens during my testing. Now, autofocus performance can vary depending on the Sony camera body you are using, so I wouldn't tell you that every Sony camera will behave exactly the same way with this lens. But on my camera, the A7 IV that I'm holding here, it was very impressive. One thing this lens does not have is optical image stabilization, and that's something I believe you need to know. But honestly, because this is a 20mm lens and I don't think it's a deal breaker for me. Wide lenses are naturally more forgiving when you're shooting handheld, because of small movements are not very obvious as they would be if you're shooting on 50, 85 or 135mm. And if you're using a Sony camera with in-body stabilization or digital stabilization, you have additional option. Just remember that the digital stabilization can crop into your image, so that is something you need to consider when you're shooting, and that is the only way you can have, you know, stabilization with this lens. The size is actually a big deal for me, and I think we are overlooking one of the biggest advantage of this lens. It is very tiny, it is very small. You see, if you are a filmmaker, you're already carrying so much equipment. You're carrying your camera, carrying this, carrying the batteries, carrying audio, you're carrying everything else. So having a full frame 20mm autofocus lens that weigh around 157 grams is actually incredibly useful. You can put this thing in your bag as a backup lens, you can travel with it, you can put it in a small camera setup, You can use it for vlogging because it's very light. You can use it for documentary work. You can use it for, you know, establishment shots. And because it takes up almost no space in your bag, there's really no reason not to have it with you if you have to use a 20mm lens. So who is this lens really for? This is why I think this lens gets really interesting. I usually don't advise people to go out and buy cheap lenses, but this is one of those lenses where I would actually make an exception, especially if you're a beginner and you are building your first full frame Sony setup. I think this is one of the affordable lens you can get. If you can't afford more expensive wide angle lenses yet, I think this can be a really good starting point. And even though I'm not a beginner, I own this lens. I bought it because I needed a wide angle lens and I didn't want to spend a huge amount of money on one just yet. And now that I've used it, I can actually see myself keeping it in my camera bag. Not necessarily as the lens that is going to replace my expensive lenses. Of course it will not, and I will still buy it. I will still buy more of that, but as the lens I carry just in case I want to travel and I need a light setup, just in case I'm shooting in a tight space, just in case something happens to my main lens, God forbid, you know. This lens is very valuable. But now let me be honest with you. Now I don't want this video to sound like I'm saying this $176 lens is better than every expensive lens. No, that is not what this video is about at all. That is not what I am saying. You can't compare this to a Sony 24mm G Master. You can't compare it with Sony 16mm to 35mm G Master. I mean, you can't compare it to proper cinema glasses, and those lenses are going to, you know, of course, going to beat it in different levels and different areas. But note that they also cost more for a reason. You are going to get better optical performance, better consistency, better build quality, and depending on the lens, better overall rendering. But that is not the question I'm asking. The question I'm asking is, for a $176 lens, what am I getting? And that is where this lens becomes really difficult to argue against, because I'm getting a full frame 20mm autofocus lens, I'm getting f2.8, I'm getting close focusing, I'm getting a tiny and lightweight body, I'm getting, you know, eye autofocus support, I'm getting electronic aperture control, I'm getting a USB-C port for firmware updates, and most importantly, I'm getting images that actually like. I love the images that come out of this camera. Like really nice. You can see it for yourself. And honestly, I think this is one of the best value beginner friendly full frame lenses I have used at this price point, and that is if I've even seen any that is this cheap or affordable. And it's not because it is perfect. It is not. The corners aren't perfect when they are wide open. There are some little distortion, there's vignetting a little bit. The image is not going to have exactly the same character or contrast as much as when I'm using a G Master lens. But when I put all of that against the price, I think this Viltrox has done something really impressive here. And this is where I also like what third-party lens manufacturers are doing right now, especially for Sony. We are getting a lot of more options. We are getting better autofocus, we are getting better optical performance, and we are getting lenses that allows people to create without having to spend a fortune before they can even start. I have actually used the Viltrox lenses before. I own the Viltrox 85mm f1.8 Mark II, and that lens has really been a solid part of my gear. So this isn't my first experience with the brand, but this 20mm genuinely surprised me. I bought it because I could not really justify spending more money on an ultra wide lens at that time, and after actually taking it out and using it, I think that's the biggest lesson here. You don't always have to spend the most money to get something useful. And at the same time, I'm not going to sit here and tell you expensive gear does not matter. I mean, it does. It's only if I'm going to be lying to you. Expensive gears actually shows in the quality of your work. Good glass matters, good cameras matters, good equipment matters, but good equipment does not automatically make you a good filmmaker. And sometimes having a $176 lens that actually allows you to go out and shoot is much more valuable than spending months waiting until you can afford a $2,000 lens. So if you are looking for a very wide, compact, full frame autofocus lens for Sony, I genuinely think this is worth considering. For me, for $176. I don't even think this is much of a question. I will buy it again if I have to. I mean, I already did. Would you want to have this in your camera bag? Let me know in the comment section. And if you want me to test more affordable film making gear like this, like in real world scenarios, you know, using my camera or any other equipment, just let me know. Catch you in my next video.